Thanks, Eric. I'm David Maloney, DC SHPO, and before Pranita gives our presentation today, I thought I would just give a few words of introduction explaining why we undertook this project. So in August 1986, and I promise this is not a long story, but it does start in 1986, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia ruled that the city's historic preservation law did not apply to the 8th Street Vista, a designated DC historic landmark, because its description in the city's inventory of historic sites was, in the court's words, so flawed that it is impossible to know what is described. The basic issue is, for those of you who may not be entirely familiar with DC's geography, 8th Street is the street midway between the Capitol and the White House. And it's the street up on which the National Archives, the old Patent Office, and DC's old Central Public Library are located. So the three buildings are in a line, and there are views, very planned, designed views between the two buildings, or the three buildings. So in effect, there are two segments to the vista. The court couldn't get its head around this notion that the vista could be two different things. So admittedly so, the description in the inventory was flawed because there was virtually no description of the 8th Street Vista beyond stating that it was there. So its existence was essentially assumed to be self-evident. But that, of course, wasn't enough. Courts settled the law based on hard evidence. Even so, however, they can't change reality, and the reality is that the result that we have is the monstrosity of Tech World, which, again, those of you who may not be familiar, is a giant building that spans the street. One of the most appalling intrusions into an intentionally planned vista between two civic landmarks anywhere. Last winter, a new apartment building started to rise near the baseball stadium in Southeast Washington. People started asking how it was allowed to stick out so far into the view of the U.S. Capitol Dome up New Jersey Avenue, and it blocks about a third of that view on New Jersey Avenue. A selling point, no doubt, that provides a great view for some of the apartments in the building. The answer is a little noticed anomaly in the city's historic designation of the L'Enfant Plan. The building is totally legal, but it still violates about a dozen stated policies in the city's comprehensive plan, calling for protection of Washington's internationally recognized historic plan. At a public meeting of the National Capital Planning Commission last May, when that body first undertook the question of guidelines for the redevelopment of the FBI site on Pennsylvania Avenue, one member suggested it shouldn't be a priority to reopen D Street, which the current building blocks, because the street is unimportant relative to Pennsylvania Avenue. That's a fair point, but reopening D Street was one of the first things that was agreed to by the agencies drafting the guidelines. And why is that? Well, among other reasons, the FBI building blocks the view from Judiciary Square, which was L'Enfant's intended site of the Supreme Court, and now the location of the district's highest court, to the Federal Triangle, which is one of the triumphs of the McMillan Commission plan for Washington. But there isn't a map that points out the importance of that view. As we've worked on the guidelines for the FBI site, we couldn't even get a map that showed the streets around the site in their proper alignment, because in the city's GIS system, the building squares are, if you will, free-floating in space. There's no polygon that shows the street rights-of-way, and that's no small matter in a system that purports to describe accurately all of the city's designated historic properties. And the street rights-of-way of the L'Enfant Plan are a designated historic property. So you could say that our most important historic landmark, in some ways, our foundational historic landmark, is left out of the city's GIS system. So enough was enough. That information gap became the straw of urgency that propelled our office to map the L'Enfant Plan in GIS for the first time. Pranita Ranbhise was the intern that we hired to undertake the mapping project, following in the footsteps of Pierre L'Enfant. She completed this work in about the same time that he had to create his city plan in the first place, which was just a few months. And like his plan, her map is still a work in progress, not quite finished. We hope it will be finished, unlike his plan. But I hope you'll agree that it's a remarkable accomplishment that will once again open our eyes to the magnificent setting of our nation's capital.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pranita, and I'm pursuing my master's in urban planning at the University of Maryland. I'm currently working with MNC PPC, but I did my summer internship at DC Office of Planning, and I worked on this project. So to begin with, I'll just give you an introduction on what the plan of the city of Washington was. So it was designed by a French-born engineer who served in the American Revolutionary War in 1791. He surveyed the site, and after surveying, he came up with a baroque plan that features traditional spaces and grand radial avenues while respecting the natural contours of the land. The result was a system of an intersecting diagonal avenues, which was superimposed on a grid system that you see in the image right here. The avenues radiated from two most significant building sites, which were to be occupied by the houses for the Congress and the President. Because of a dispute, Lafond was dismissed by Washington in 1793, after which he left with his plans. But even today, you can see the heritage of his plan. The main objective, like David mentioned, was to be able to visualize the street system in DC and to be able to perform graphical analysis. Most people from DC would know how the street system is. There are numbers and there are alphabets, like lettered streets, diagonal avenues, but sometimes these diagonals and circles are a little confusing, so a graphical analysis would make it really easy to be able to visualize everything. This visualization will also help to evaluate consistency of the current street network with the historical plats. It will also help inspect various field conditions and analyze various aspects of the plan, such as intrusions and alterations, and to identify if there are any gaps between the historical protection, and of course, to create multiple maps. So in our scope, we worked with 4 historical maps. We started off with the 1803 King Platts map. This was prepared by Nicholas King, who was a surveyor working with the Army Corps of Engineers in 1796. What he did was he prepared an elegant and detailed map of the city, which, while it was being platted on the ground, the map shows all of the streets and avenues and public spaces of Lafond City Plan, including 17 appropriations set aside for the use of federal government. It also shows the boundaries of holdings of original proprietors of land within the city limits and a few early improvements such as bridges and wharfs. What is particularly useful about this map was that there are handwritten dimensions for each of the squares and the street widths. So when we created the street network, it was really useful to use these dimensions. Unfortunately, based on the quadrants, each of these, there were 16 separate maps. There was not one single map. So all of these 16 maps had to be cut and then stitched together to create one single map, and then it had to be geo-referenced. And at least one of them was distorted, and which appears to be a photographic image taken at a particular angle. That's on the extreme right, actually, which you see in black and white. So we used this map as our base map to create various GIS layers. The next map was the 1861 Boschke map that we used, which was prepared by Albert Boschke, a German-born civil engineer. He created the first map in 1857, showing locations of every structure in the city. In 1861, he then created a complete map of the entire District of Columbia, showing topography, buildings, and landscape features. Even though the 1857 was a little more detailed, we used the 1861 because it's a single photographic image of the entire city without any cuts or joins. This map also shows some early features that are gone today. If you note the canal through the city and the added city blocks at the east end of the mall. The next one was the 1894. This was the third map that we used, which is the Reservations Map. After decades after the Civil War, an enormous population growth and major physical transformation happened in Washington. One of the most important features of the city plan introduced in this era was the system of public reservations that created necklaces of triangular parks along the city's avenues. The components of the system changed many times as neighborhoods developed and as railroad facilities expanded. And the system was finally standardized in 1894, where you have 301 reservations identified on the 1894 map, which became the official beginning of the city's park system. This map was our starting point for adding park reservations to our GIS layers. The next one was the 1937 map. At the turn of the 20th century, Washington began another physical transformation with the McMillan Commission plan for the city. This plan envisioned return of the LaFon's guiding document, but also created a vision for the new land reclaimed from the mud flats along Potomac River. Most of the improvements from the McMillan plan were completed in the first 3 decades, and they're all shown in this map. The 1937 map was not drawn to be technically accurate in all details, but it does document some major changes that were brought in by this McMillan plan. So our basic methodology was, I had to start off with getting familiar with the nature of the historic designations, understanding component elements like avenues and streets, various places, the historic qualities, which included views, vistas, and landscapes. So using this understanding and 1803 King Platts map as our base map, I created the street network. The street network has street names. It has, the maps have shorelines for each year that we have mapped. It also has parcels with square numbers. And in 1937, a lot of minor streets and alleys were being introduced. So we've mapped those as well. So it has street names, the years these streets were built, when the squares were subdivided, when the year when the subdivision was approved or designated. So just, since this is an initial phase and it's a data creation phase, we've not moved to the analysis. So I'm just going to run through a few images of maps that we have created based on some overlays or some analysis that can be performed. So this is the 1803 map that we created. If you see on the zoomed in image right there, you'll notice with each year, the squares, the structure of these squares has changed drastically. So this is in 1861. You see a few squares are not there anymore. And then again, this has expanded a little bit in 1894. And then in 1937, there's again another difference. Now, if you notice, again, the shorelines has changed over time as well. In the zoomed in image, you'll see that shoreline. In 1861, it's moved a little bit, and it's not there in the 1894 map, and then again in 1937 one. Another thing what we did was to be able to compare all of the shorelines, how they have moved over time. And what I've done is I've just overlaid the shorelines for all of the years together. It's a little difficult to make out in this image because there are 4 shorelines and a little different colors, but you can play around a little bit with the visualization. This is the 1803 map, which the street network, which is overlaid with the current street network. And if you see in the zoomed in images, the image, you will notice a lot of difference in avenues and streets that have moved or that have been created or that the squares have been subdivided. This one is 1803 overlaid with 1937. Like I mentioned, in the 1937 map, we saw a number of minor streets that had been introduced, and you can see all of those minor streets right here in the zoomed image. We also created parcels. I didn't, it was just the outline of the parcels, the squares that we created. And this one is an overlay of the 1803 parcels with the 1937, and you'll see a lot of subdivision of parcels and a lot of parcels that have been created after 1803. This is the reservations map that we created based on the 1803 King Platts map. And this is an overlay of the 1803 on the current street, the current parcel data that we had. And again, like I mentioned, there are multiple ways of being able to visualize all of this, and you can play a lot with the overlays, but this is again another thing that you can do is overlay it with the current data to see how the squares have moved. So just to conclude, we all have seen today in a lot of presentations how GIS can be used, and this was one of the things that we wanted to do, is to be able to study changes over time and be able to identify historical gaps. So this data, it's just the beginning, and it's an ongoing project, and yeah, there's a lot more to do in the future. Thank you.
Okay, and we have some time for questions for the 2 presenters. No takers? Okay. All right. Well, if anything comes to anybody between now and the next presentation, feel free to ask. And we're going to be taking a break until 2:15, and then we'll resume for our last presentation of the afternoon. Thank you.